God is not fazed by the fact that the warring nations are ranting and raging against him. He is scorning them. And in verse 5, God speaks. So verse 4, God laughs. Verse 5, God speaks. And verse 6, God acts. He speaks in a terrifying fury. And he speaks, no doubt, through prophets in all sorts of ways. But then, verse 6, what he says is what he does. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So God is establishing a regime through which the world will be called to account. Now, at this point, many people have serious questions. Are we really saying that the house of David and Solomon, and they were mixed blessings themselves, as we know from 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, but then particularly their successors, many of them really went to the bad and didn't behave in the right way at all? Are we really saying that the royal house of David is the ultimate answer? This is part of the extraordinary to and fro of the Old Testament, as we'll see in various other passages as well. There's a sense that the vocation of Israel, Abraham's family, and within that the vocation of the king, the royal Davidic king, is indeed God's purpose for the world, even though later and further on we will see that bad things happen there. And there are tensions set up in the Old Testament which are only then resolved when we see the true king, the true Davidic monarch, Jesus of Nazareth himself, the anointed one. We have to live with those tensions. We shouldn't flatten them out. We shouldn't pretend they're not there, because actually the tension between the goodness of God's promises about David and the fact that we, like Samuel in 1 Samuel, when the people first want a king, Samuel says, I shouldn't do that if I were you. Sounds as though you're rejecting God and you won't like it when you get a king. These warnings are important too, but there's a sense that these different strands move forwards and they finally meet in Jesus, and specifically on his cross. We'll come back to that on another occasion. So there is throughout the Psalter a sense of God's call of David and David's family. David, who lives in Jerusalem, makes it his capital, and who decides to build a house for the Lord, although in fact it's his son Solomon who builds the house. But they establish this house as the place to which Israel and then the world should come in worship. And that, of course, runs all the way through the Old Testament. But as we see the story from Genesis through to 1 and 2 Samuel, this is the story. God is saying, yes, the nations are in a mess, but I am working my purpose out, and here is the king who will put things right. And in the brief monarchy of David and Solomon, there's all sorts of issues that are settled not totally satisfactorily, but for a brief moment, there's a vision of what it might look like for a world to be at peace and a world to be ruled wisely. And the theme of wisdom goes very closely with the Davidic monarchy, not least because of Solomon as the archetypal wise man in the Old Testament, therefore calling the nations to be wise and to learn from God in the last bit of this psalm. So then what does the king himself say? This is, as I said, one of those points where the psalm shifts from talking about God as he to the king himself speaking. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And this looks across to 2 Samuel 7, when God says to David, I will raise up your seed after you, and I will be his father, and he will be my son, and he will build the house for my name. And 2 Samuel 7 goes very closely with Psalm 2, both in the Old Testament exposition of who the Davidic monarch is called to be, and in the later Jewish retrieval of that, as people in the last centuries before the time of Jesus are drawing on these passages to speculate about how is God going to put things right eventually. There's a lot of use made of those passages before the time of Jesus. And then in the New Testament itself, there's an explosion of Davidic reference with this psalm and 2 Samuel 7 at the center of it, that the king is to be God's son. And only when we fully understand who Jesus was and is, do we see that this wasn't just a grandiose metaphor. This establishment of the Davidic monarchy was, as it were, a job description written for God's own use. That God calls David and then Solomon and their successors, knowing that they are imperfect, knowing that they will get things wrong and mess it up and things will go horribly wrong, but knowing as well that he, God, will come in the person of his second self to be the one through whom the nations will in fact be called to account.